Welcome. We turn our attention today to a profoundly disturbing case, one that involves the tragic loss of young lives. Please be aware that the details we will discuss concern the disappearance and deaths of children, and may be deeply upsetting. We approach the subject with the gravity it deserves.
Absolutely. Our purpose here is to carefully examine the sequence of events surrounding the disappearance and deaths of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers in West Memphis, Arkansas. This started back in May of 1993.
And we'll follow the subsequent investigation and legal proceedings as well.
Exactly. We're drawing upon, news articles, legal documents, investigative reports, trying to piece together how this tragedy unfolded.
So let's start at the beginning. May 5th, 1993. This is when three 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, were reported missing.
That's right. The initial police report, it was made around 7 o'clock in the evening.
And that was by John Mark Byers, Christopher's adoptive father.
Yes, that was him.
Earlier that evening, maybe around 6:30, neighbors had actually seen the boys. They were playing together.
And Terry Hobbs, who is Stevie Branch's stepfather, was reportedly seen calling the children home around that time, too.
So a limited police search started that night.
It did, yes, limited. Friends and neighbors also mounted their own search effort. They even briefly went into the area where the bodies were eventually discovered.
But they didn't find them that night.
No. And later, a defense medical examiner actually estimated the time of death was likely much later, between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. on May 6th.
So into the early hours of the next morning?
Exactly. And then on May 6th, 1993, the bodies of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers were found in Robin Hood Hills. Just a devastating discovery.
Horrifying. The initial autopsies, what did they conclude?
They determined that Christopher Byers died from blood loss. Michael Moore and Stevie Branch, they had drowned.
But these findings didn't remain straightforward, did they?
Not at all. They quickly became, points of major controversy. Questions immediately popped up about the time of death estimates.
And the interpretation of the scene.
Yes, the forensics. Specifically, the wounds on Byers, were they from a knife attack, or could it have been animal predation after death? There was also debate about potential sexual assault.
And even where the murders actually happened.
Right. The location itself, this early controversy, about the time of death and the forensics, it's really crucial because it immediately casts some doubt on the initial police narrative. It highlights maybe potential inexperience, maybe biases.
It sets a tone of uncertainty right from the start. Was there anything else from the autopsies?
Well, it was found that Christopher Byers had a subtherapeutic level of Ritalin in his system, or possibly carbamazepine. The initial report mentioned both. He'd been prescribed Ritalin earlier that year.
Okay. And there was something else mentioned around that time about a sighting near the crime scene.
Yes, that's significant too. On the evening of May 5th, a black male individual was reportedly seen at a Bojangles restaurant, not far from the scene.
What was unusual about him?
Witnesses said he appeared disoriented, and importantly, he had a bleeding arm. Police checked the restroom the next day, collected some blood samples. But tragically, those samples were later reported lost.
Lost evidence. That seems like a recurring theme here. Let's talk about the initial investigation itself. It was handled by the West Memphis Police Department, right?
Correct. And it's been noted, widely noted, that the department really lacked experience in homicide cases, especially something on this scale, a triple child murder.
And the record keeping.
Described as a mess. Disorganized. On top of that, the WMPD reportedly turned down offers of help from experienced violent crime experts at the Arkansas State Police.
That's surprising. Why turn down help?
It's hard to say for sure. But it sounds like the initial investigation was just fraught with problems from the get-go. You have to wonder how much that inexperience, the alleged mishandling of evidence, contributed to where the focus eventually landed.
You mean towards the teenagers?
Potentially, yes. And there were other issues, too. Reports of evidence being stored improperly, like in supermarket bags.
Seriously?
Apparently so. And a small amount of blood found right at the scene was never even tested.
Never tested. And wasn't there something about the lack of blood where the bodies were found?
Exactly. That's a huge point. Reports indicate no significant blood was found right there at the immediate discovery site.
Which suggests?
It strongly suggests the primary crime scene where the injuries occurred was likely somewhere else. That seems like a massive lead that wasn't maybe pursued hard enough. Why wasn't finding that primary scene a bigger focus?
And the police struggled to control the narrative too, right? Information leaks, speculation.
Yes, they failed to manage the flow of information, and speculation just ran wild in the community. Add to that, the coroner wasn't called for almost 2 hours after a shoe was found,
2 hours?
leading to a significant delay in their arrival. And the creek where the bodies lay wasn't drained and properly secured in a timely way either. It just adds to the picture of a chaotic initial response.
Were there any early suspects before the focus shifted?
There were. Briefly, 2 teenagers, Chris Morgan and Brian Holland. They had histories of drug offenses.
And they left town shortly after the bodies were found.
Yes, 4 days later, they headed to California. Both reportedly showed deception on polygraphs when asked about involvement.
Deception. Did anything come of that?
Well, Morgan apparently made a statement at one point saying he might have killed the victims, but he quickly recanted it. It's really unclear how thoroughly they were ever investigated beyond that initial look.
Okay. And then there was John Mark Byers, Christopher's adoptive father. He came under suspicion too, didn't he?
He did, yes.
Yeah.
Early on, he was actually a frequent police informant.
An informant. And wasn't he under investigation himself at the time?
Yes, a federal investigation for grand theft. He also had a prior criminal history, things like terroristic threats, drug offenses, theft.
And he admitted disciplining Christopher shortly before he disappeared.
Correct. He admitted whipping him with a belt. So initially, the police did look at Byers as a possible suspect.
Then there was the incident with the knife he gave to the documentary crew.
Right. That was later. He gave them a knife, and it appeared to have bloodstains on it. His story about it changed.
How so?
First, he denied using it, then said he'd used it on deer meat. Testing found blood with a genotype matching both him and Christopher.
Which isn't definitive given they're related.
Exactly. It shares genetic markers, so it was inconclusive. Later, Byers sort of suggested he might have just accidentally left the knife out.
He also took a polygraph during that documentary filming.
He did, and passed. But questions were raised about the result because he was taking psychoactive prescription medications at the time.
Which can affect polygraph results.
Potentially, yes. And another odd thing, he had all his teeth removed in 1997. Gave conflicting reasons why.
And didn't an expert see something in the autopsy photos?
Yes, a possible imprint on Christopher's body that looked like it could be from a belt buckle. When confronted with that, Byers then acknowledged he had disciplined Christopher shortly before he went missing.
So, a lot of strange circumstances surrounding him.
Definitely. But the investigation eventually moved in a different direction, focusing heavily on Jessie Misskelley Jr.
Right, and his interrogation and confession became incredibly controversial.
Hugely controversial. Let's unpack that.
Okay, so Misskelley was young, he had a low IQ, and police questioned him alone.
For about 12 hours, yes, alone. And crucially, only about 46 minutes of that entire interrogation was actually recorded.
12 hours, 46 minutes recorded. That seems disproportionate, and no parent consented.
Not explicitly, no. Not for the interrogation itself. Initially, he denied any involvement.
But then he confessed. How did that happen?
After he took a polygraph test, police told him he failed it.
They told him he failed. Was that true?
No, it was false. They told him he failed, and then he confessed. But you have to ask, given the inconsistencies that came out later, the claims of coercion, how much weight can you really put on that confession?
What kind of inconsistencies?
Well, his account contained factual errors, like the time of death he gave was completely wrong. Lots of inconsistencies with the known facts. And he later recanted.
On what grounds?
He said he was coerced, intimidated, that he was exhausted after hours of questioning, that police made threats.
Did he understand his rights, Miranda rights?
He claimed he didn't fully understand them, the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney. Despite all this, though, the Arkansas Supreme Court ruled in 1996 that his confession was legally voluntary.
Wow. Even with all those red flags?
Yes, and parts of his statements were also leaked to the press, which muddied the waters further.
Did he stick to one story after the initial confession?
No, he gave subsequent contradictory confessions to police and even to his own lawyers. Then he'd recant parts that offer more details, though one detail did apparently corroborate the location of a whiskey bottle found near the scene.
It sounds incredibly confusing.
It is. An expert witness at his trial actually called the confession a classic example of police coercion.
Did the defense try to demonstrate how suggestible he might be?
They did. They actually got him to falsely confess to a robbery, just as an experiment to show the court. But the judge ruled that demonstration inadmissible.
Inadmissible. Okay. Was there anyone corroborating his involvement?
A friend, Buddy Lucas, came forward. He claimed Misskelley had confessed to him, said he'd witnessed the murders the day after they happened. Lucas also gave police shoes he claimed Misskelley wore.
And Misskelley himself was pressured later.
Yes. During the legal process for Echols and Baldwin, the prosecutor apparently tried to coerce Misskelley into testifying against them. His defense argued this violated his constitutional rights, his Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights.
Which brings us to Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin. They were friends, right?
Yes, friends. Shared interests in music, fiction, kind of outsiders in the conservative culture of West Memphis. They knew Misskelley, but weren't, like, close friends.
Echols had a difficult background.
Yes. Came from a poor family, frequent contact with social workers, poor school attendance record. But critically, there was no physical evidence connecting either Echols or Baldwin to the crime scene. None.
So their convictions were based on
Circumstantial evidence, primarily. And Misskelley's confession, even though it wasn't technically admissible in their trial, it was widely reported that the jury knew about it and likely considered it.
And their initial appeals failed.
They did. The convictions were upheld initially.
What was the circumstantial evidence used against them? It sounds like the prosecution focused a lot on Echols' interests.
They really did. His interest in the occult, the way he dressed, the heavy metal music he listened to, books he read, like Stephen King. It was all woven into this narrative, linking him to the crime, tapping into the satanic panic fears prevalent at the time.
That reliance on cultural anxieties instead of hard evidence? Looking back, it's quite chilling, isn't it? How fear can sway things. What does that say about the climate back then?
It speaks volumes. It allowed things like testimony from a self-described cult expert who, it turned out, had a fraudulent PhD to be taken seriously in court.
What did this expert claim?
He pointed to things like the victim's age, 8, the number 3, the fact that Echols wore black, suggesting these were signs of an occult ritual. Pure speculation presented as expertise.
And there was testimony from some young girls.
Yes. 2 girls claimed Echols had confessed to them, but their stories were inconsistent, were seriously questioned later on.
What about police testimony regarding Echols?
Detective Ridge testified that Echols made statements about demonic forces, interest in figures like Anton LaVey and Aleister Crowley. But this testimony was actually contradicted by the detective's own notes from the interview and by what Echols himself said.
So inconsistencies there too. This case obviously got a lot of attention later.
Massive attention, largely thanks to documentaries like the Paradise Lost series and later West of Memphis, plus books like Devil's Knot. They really brought the details and the doubts to a wider audience.
And that led to support from some high-profile people.
Absolutely. Figures like Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, Johnny Depp, Eddie Vedder. They became involved, provided significant support, helped fund further investigations and the ongoing legal battles.
Let's pivot back to the physical evidence, or lack thereof, presented at the trial. What was actually introduced?
Okay, there were fibers, 2 green threads and 1 red rayon fiber found near the scene. The prosecution claimed they were similar to items from Echols' sister's closet and Baldwin's home.
But the defense?
The defense countered, quite reasonably, that these types of fibers are incredibly common. Finding them proved basically nothing concrete.
What about hairs?
A couple of human hairs found on the victims' bodies. One was Caucasian. Microscopically, it was similar to hair from Echols, another suspect, and even one of the victim's fathers. So, very limited evidentiary value.
Basically useless for pinpointing someone.
Pretty much.
Any other hairs found?
Yes. A hair of African-American origin was found on the sheet used to transport Christopher Byers' body. Another hair, which didn't match the defendants, victims, or known suspects, was found in the ligatures binding Byers.
You're nuts.
Yes. Also, a dyed hair on the sheet covering Stevie Branch and another hair on a nearby tree stump. Lots of hairs, none definitively linking Echols, Baldwin, or Misskelley.
Okay, what else? Candle wax?
Okay, blue candle wax. Found on one victim's shirt. It was the same color as wax found on a book Echols owned, and also a candle in someone else's trailer entirely.
Did it match?
No. The prosecution's own expert testified that the wax sample seized from Echols and elsewhere did not match the wax from the crime scene.
So, another dead end presented as potentially incriminating.
It seems that way. The way the victims were tied was also discussed. The defense suggested the knots might indicate a single perpetrator, or maybe that the victims were forced to tie each other.
And Byers had no defense wounds.
Correct. Christopher Byers had no defensive wounds, which might suggest he was tied up after he was already dead or unconscious.
What about the shoes and shoelaces found at the scene?
Never individually matched to any specific victim. nor were they compared forensically to belongings of any suspects.
Any other items?
There was a pendant found at Damien Echols' home. It had blood on it.
Whose blood?
The testing at the time showed a type consistent with about 11% of the population. It was similar to Damien's type, possibly Jason's, possibly one of the victims. It was never introduced as evidence at trial and never retested later with better technology.
Why wasn't it introduced? Seems significant.
Unknown, but it wasn't used. The defense also argued that the wounds themselves didn't really fit the prosecution's theory of a violent knife attack by 3 teenagers. The nature and pattern of the wounds, particularly on Byers, raised questions. And then there were the alleged bite marks on Stevie Branch's forehead.
Allege.
Yes. They weren't mentioned in the initial autopsy or trial. They came up later. And when analyzed, they did not match the teeth of Echols, Baldwin, or Misskelley.
And the knife found in the lake knife.
Ah, yes. Found in a lake near Baldwin's house. It didn't match the description Misskelley gave of the murder weapon in his confession.
Was there any evidence linking it to the crime?
No testimony connected it to the scene at all. Yet the prosecutor, in his closing arguments, strongly implied it was the murder weapon.
That seems highly prejudicial.
It was certainly controversial. So that's the picture at the time of the trial and convictions. But things changed significantly post-conviction, didn't they?
Dramatically, especially with DNA testing.
Right. In 2007, new DNA testing was performed, and it excluded Echols, Baldwin, and Misskelley as the source of the DNA found at the scene. This was mitochondrial DNA, mind you, not as specific as nuclear DNA, but it still definitively ruled them out as contributors to those specific samples.
And did it point to anyone else?
Yes. This was huge. DNA consistent with Terry Hobbs, Stevie Branch's stepfather, was found on a ligature used to bind Michael Moore.
Wow. On the ligature itself?
Yes. And DNA consistent with a man named David Jacoby, who was known to be with Hobbs before and after the boys disappeared, was found on a tree root near the bodies.
So DNA points towards Hobbs and someone associated with him. Had Hobbs' wife, Pam, suspected anything earlier?
She had. Years before the DNA results, Pam Hobbs, Stevie's mother, had actually come forward with information she believed linked Terry Hobbs to the murders.
How did Terry Hobbs react to being implicated, especially publicly?
Well, he filed a defamation lawsuit against Natalie Maines from the Dixie Chicks after she publicly suggested he was involved.
What happened with that lawsuit?
It was dismissed by the court.
Did any experts weigh in after these developments?
Yes. Johnny Douglas, the well-known former FBI profiler, he looked at the case files and concluded the murders were likely done by one person, probably motivated by revenge against one of the families.
Not 3 teenagers performing a ritual.
No. He saw no evidence of satanic rituals and didn't believe it fit the profile of 3 teenagers acting together. He thought it was more personal, targeted.
And more issues came out about the original trial, right? About the jury.
Yes. It emerged that the jury foreman in the Echols-Baldwin trial had apparently discussed the case with an attorney during the trial and had shared inadmissible evidence, likely Misskelley's confession, with other jurors.
That's serious juror misconduct.
Absolutely. And Misskelley's lawyer also testified later about improper communications between the judge and the jury while they were deliberating.
So the convictions themselves are looking increasingly shaky. What about further DNA testing?
Echols petitioned for more testing using newer, more sensitive technology. It was initially denied.
Why deny?
The lower courts ruled against it. But the Arkansas Supreme Court overturned that decision, saying they did have the right to seek new testing based on new scientific methods. This applied initially to all 3, and later specifically addressed the impact of their Alford pleas on this right.
And evidence needed for testing? There were reports it was lost?
There were scary moments. Initially, reports surfaced that crucial physical evidence had been lost or even destroyed in a fire.
Oh, no.
But later investigation found that, thankfully, most of it was still intact. Echols then filed a suit specifically for access to that evidence for the advanced testing. And just recently, in 2024, the Arkansas Supreme Court ruled again, very importantly.
What was the ruling?
They ruled that Echols' Alford plea from years ago did not prevent him from petitioning for new testing based on new scientific evidence available today. A major victory for his continued fight.
That's huge for his pursuit of exoneration. Have the victims' families' views changed over time?
Some have, yes. John Mark Byers, Christopher's father, who initially believed they were guilty, now strongly believes the West Memphis Three are innocent.
And Pam Hobbs, Stevie's mother.
She publicly questioned the convictions back in 2007, around the time the first DNA results came out.
What about Terry Hobbs? Has anything else come up regarding him?
Well, linguistic analysis of a police interview he gave noted his very frequent use of, an apparent uncertainty when shown a photo, which some statement analysts find indicative. Also, since 2013, written statements from two individuals, Billy Wayne Stewart and Benny Guy, have been introduced as potential evidence, though their full impact is still debated.
So despite the initial reports of lost evidence, most of it is secure now.
It seems so. After that 2021 scare about a fire, it was confirmed most evidence is intact, which is crucial for the ongoing testing efforts.
Okay, let's talk about the Alford plea in 2011. How did that come about, and what did it mean?
All right, so in August 2011, after over 18 years in prison, Echols, Baldwin, and Misskelley were released. They entered what's called an Alford plea to lesser charges of murder.
What exactly is an Alford plea?
It's a strange legal mechanism. It allows a defendant to maintain their innocence. They don't admit guilt, but they acknowledge that the prosecution has enough evidence that a conviction is likely if the case went to trial again.
So they maintain innocence but agree the state could probably convict them.
Essentially, yes. They were sentenced to time served, the 18-plus years, plus the suspended sentence, and were released.
Why agree to that kind of deal, especially if they maintained innocence?
Several factors were likely involved. The new DNA evidence casting doubt on their guilt, but also implicating someone else. Support from some victims' families who now doubted the original convictions. Questions about witness credibility from the original trial. And the death of a key evidence collector, which could complicate a retrial for the prosecution. It was likely seen as the surest, quickest way out of prison.
But there were conditions, right?
A big one. The agreement barred them from suing the state for wrongful imprisonment.
So they couldn't seek compensation for the years they lost. Did they seek pardons?
Yes, but Governor Beebe denied a pardon request, saying he'd need new evidence definitively proving someone else committed the crime.
What was the prosecutor's stance at the time of the plea?
Scott Ellington, the prosecutor, said he still personally believed they were guilty. But he also acknowledged that, given all the new developments, a retrial would be very difficult for the state and likely result in acquittal.
So even the prosecution saw the writing on the wall for a retrial. How do the victims' families feel now? Are they united?
No, sadly they remain divided. Some believe the West Memphis Three are innocent, others still believe they're guilty. It's another layer of tragedy in this case.
So while they're free, this plea leaves a lingering question mark, doesn't it? It's not a full exoneration. What does that say about the justice system when this is the outcome?
It highlights a real difficulty. It's a legal gray area. They aren't officially cleared, their convictions weren't overturned in the traditional sense, but the state essentially conceded that holding on to those convictions was untenable. For someone like Echols, who desperately wants full exoneration, it's obviously not the final answer.
Right, it means the fight continues for him. What have they done since their release?
Jason Baldwin moved to Seattle. He's in a relationship, and last we heard, had plans to study law, actually.
Interesting. And Damien Echols?
He's really focused on art and writing. He published a memoir, Almost Home, Vol. 1, co-authored another book, Yours for Eternity, does voice acting work. And he continues to be very vocal about seeking full exoneration.
His art often references the case.
Yes, he draws direct parallels between his experience and historical injustices, like the Salem witch trials, exploring themes of wrongful conviction and societal fear.
And he reaffirmed that commitment to exoneration recently.
Yes, in August 2021, even when it seemed the evidence might be lost, he made it clear he wouldn't stop fighting. And his legal team kept pushing for that DNA testing.
Which led to the recent positive rulings from the Arkansas Supreme Court.
Exactly. The initial rejection of his testing motion was reversed in April 2023, and the 2024 ruling cemented his right to pursue testing despite the Alford plea. So, that door remains open.
It's clear this story is far from over for him.
Definitely not. The details we've walked through today, they remain just profoundly somber, deeply disturbing.
And despite all the years, all the investigations, the documentaries, the legal battles, there are still no definitive answers about what truly happened to Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers back in 1993. So many questions remain.
It's a case that continues to haunt West Memphis and, really, anyone who learns about it. If you found this exploration valuable, we do hope you'll consider subscribing so you don't miss our future looks into complex cases like this one.
And please do leave your comments below. We welcome your reflections on this very tragic sequence of events.